The good, old Middle Ages. The writer of Hammer of Witches is revealed to be a depraved person. A succubus crowns the pope, peasants rebel over rights to first night, and anal sex results in a 7-year penance. In the early Middle Ages, the Church had not yet completely absorbed the sex lives of the laity. According to Alexander Sidorov, who holds a doctorate in historical sciences, in his article, The Middle Ages, Sex, Food and Culture, nobles and church hierarchs often lived with concubines during this period, and marriages of commoners were concluded simply by the fact of long cohabitation. Over time, the Church exerted control over all forms of sexual expression, including prostitution. According to the same Alexander Sidorov, the clergy behaved quite freely, even with novices in monasteries, while the laity were forbidden many things. For example, sex was to take place only in the missionary position. All other actions were considered perversion, and for them they imposed penance, punishment in the form of restriction in food or something else. As he writes in the above article, for anal sex, 7 years of penance could be imposed, with very strict dietary restrictions and a rigid regimen of prayer. But even these restrictions were not enough. According to medieval pastors, a woman should be silent, cold and distant in bed, acting as if she wasn't very interested in the process itself. One day these recommendations led to a wild incident. Legend has it that a certain nobleman, returning late at night from the hunt, decided to look in on his wife. She was quiet and still as usual, so he quickly finished his business and went to rest. Later he was horrified to discover that his wife had died shortly before his return. After this incident, wives were sometimes required to show signs of life during coitus to avoid embarrassment. While restricting others, the priests themselves did not deny themselves anything. In addition to going to brothels and using young disciples for pleasure, the laity also had their share. Rosalie Gilbert, in her book, The Very Secret Sex Lives of Medieval Women, an inside look at women and sex in medieval times, tells of a priest named Pierre Clergeau. The prodigal priest from the French village of Montaillot took advantage of her mother's absence from home to persuade some Grisita Reeve to have sex with him. The returning mother did not scandalize the scoundrel, but took such a deed calmly and did not pay attention to visits to the daughter of lustful Pierre. And even after he had arranged the marriage between Grisita and another Pierre, whose surname was Lysia, the relationship continued with her husband's consent, until the girl got tired of it. So much for the Swedish family the French way. How to avoid the appearance of horns on which it is uncomfortable to wear a crusader's helmet. By using a fidelity belt, of course, a metal construction that prevents lovers from reaching the young lady. This is how the legend of the origin and spread of the fidelity belt in the Middle Ages, which has been popular in the 19th century. And to confirm this tale, the museums of Paris and London even had some examples on display. Modern researchers are skeptical about the reality of the use of this object in those ancient times. The American historian and medievalist Albrecht Klassen, in his book, The Medieval Chastity Belt, A Myth-Making Process, The New Middle Ages, points out that the prolonged wearing of such an article of clothing contradicts modern medical research, because a woman simply could not survive the appearance of serious health problems related to hygiene, which would begin after only a few days of wearing it. Well, research into the examples in museums has shown that they all date from the 19th century. As the historian Kate Goldbaum wrote in her article, What are chastity belts? Really? For the live science, I have traveled abroad and looked at art collections, but I have yet to see a fidelity belt whose origins can be traced back to the Middle Ages. So where does this myth come from? There are several origins. Early medieval theologians repeatedly mentioned the cingulum chastitatis, Latin for chastity belt. But they used it figuratively, pleading for protection against the temptation to fall into carnal sin. For example, a theologian and scholar of Charlemagne called Alcuin asks, "Deliver me from past sins, protect me from present sins, strengthen me from future sins. Give me abstinence from food and drink, the belt of chastity, purity of heart and lips." It is doubtful that he wanted an iron version of the undergarment for himself. The next source is the first depiction of the Belt of Fidelity, which is known from a treatise on siege engines. It was written in 1405 by the German engineer and artist Conrad Kaiser. As well as serious descriptions of the technological innovations of the time, the book also contains a humorous section. It describes the construction of an invisibility cloak and a fidelity belt, which, according to the author, were worn by Florentine women to protect their virtue from rapists. According to the same Klassen, but it is a joke and nothing more, as the context and the monstrosity of the metal cage show. The next origin of the legend comes from engravings known since the 16th century. They all have similar themes. A half-naked woman wearing a fidelity belt hands a key to an old and ugly husband with donkey ears or other signs of foolishness and jealousy, while a young man with the same key lurks nearby. These images figuratively depict the folly of jealous husbands and the unfaithfulness of wives, rather than proving the real existence of the practice of such belts. The best proof of its existence in the Middle Ages would be an archaeological find. And it is even mentioned in Dr. Eric John Dingwall's book, The Girdle of Chastity, a medico-historical study. Dingwall writes that in the late 19th century, a German antiquities collector named Anton Pichinger unearthed the skeleton of a young woman wearing a chastity belt in Austria, and the remains were dated to the 16th century. Unfortunately, the skeleton later disappeared somewhere. So, did the chastity belt really exist in the Middle Ages? More likely no than yes, and we owe its current popularity to the Victorian Puritans, who loved dark tales of the terrible past, and to blacksmiths who warmed their hands by selling gullible people the most authentic fidelity belts. One of the famous traditions of the Middle Ages was the Rite of the Liege, better known to us as the Rite of the First Night. Even Mel Gibson's film Braveheart depicts this disgusting custom when the bride of the main character's friend is kidnapped and killed by a local lord because she refuses to spend the night with him. The historical roots of this tradition may have been the Germanic Beilager. According to this, a lord could spend the night with any girl who was dependent on him immediately after the wedding. To prevent this, the groom would pay a ransom. Later, sex was replaced by symbols. In some places, the lord would jump over the bride at the wedding. In others, he would put his bare foot on the marriage bed. But there were also more serious cases. At the end of the 15th century, for example, Catalan peasants accused their lords of molesting girls lying on the nuptial bed, instead of simply stepping over them as was traditional. As a result, the peasants revolted and, once they had won, they demanded the abolition of this shameful custom, which was done by the feudal lords, who were afraid of the people's wrath. However, according to the historian and medievalist Anna Adashinskaya in her article, How They Came Up with Medieval History, such traditions were mostly just a legal and symbolic demonstration of the peasants' dependence on the lords, and allowed them to demand payment from the newlyweds under the threat of the realization of the lord's right. Nevertheless, the decision of the Court of Arbitration in the Spanish town of Guadalupe in 1486, with the help of which King Edward the Catholic abolished the right of the first night of his lords, shows that such a legal right existed, at least in theory. The world of sex in the Middle Ages was shrouded in mysticism. According to the priests of the time, men and women were in constant danger of being attacked by witchcraft and demonic forces. Women, in particular, were often accused of practicing witchcraft and of having a tendency towards magic and debauchery. Heinrich Kramer, the author of the famous treatise, Hammer of Witches, believed that women could use witchcraft to deprive men of potency and generally harm them in all sorts of ways. It is true that not all his contemporaries saw Kramer as an example of a sincere fighter for chastity and faith. Historian Ksenia Chepakova cites a case that occurred in the city of Innsbruck in 1485. Kramer accused several women of witchcraft, but when he interrogated the alleged witches, there was embarrassment. The local bishop, who had read the documents of the investigation, was unpleasantly surprised. The fighter for chastity asked the women, with a certain manic interest, for details of their intimate life, with whom, in what position, how often, and so on. As a result, the unfortunate women were released and the old pervert was politely asked to leave. Nevertheless, many churchmen considered witches to be quite real and described their interactions with demonic tempters in astonishing detail. The 13th century Bishop of Paris, William of Auvergne, believed that demons had no physical embodiment and therefore could not conceive children. And so, they resorted to cunning. In the form of a succubus, demon woman, they seduced men, received seed from them, and in the form of an incubus, demon man, they impregnated women with this seed, from which terrible monsters were born. Incubus had unusual features of physical structure. Researcher Alexander Makov, in the book Hostis Antiquus, Categories and Images of Medieval Christian Demonology, describes its appearance as follows. The incubus was ascribed an unusual physical nature. Its sexual organ is represented as forked. It resembles a snake. It is an iron rod. It is icy. Succubus, on the other hand, looked like seductive women who would do anything to lead a righteous man astray. In the same book, the author tells of a priest, Benoit Berne, who was burned at the age of 80. The priest claimed to have lived for 40 years with a beautiful succubus called Hermione. But the most interesting of all is a story that took place in Vilna in 1597 and was told in the 17th century by Adrian Regenvols, a Polish author. A certain Zacharias was courting Bietka, but her parents refused the poor man. Then he became sad, laid his hands on himself and rose in the form of an incubus spirit and offered the girl to marry him. So it happened, and rumors about the girl living with a demon spread all over the country, after which success came to Bietka. She took money for her husband's predictions and became fabulously rich, until the story ended tragically. An Italian sorcerer came to Vilna whose personal demon assistant had escaped from his ring. The sorcerer looked closely at Zachariah and recognized his fugitive, who had been fooling the girl and the others. After capturing the demon and returning it to the ring, the satisfied sorcerer rode away. Even the highest church hierarchs were not shy about dealing with succubus. The book The Latin Poems, written by Walter Mapes in 1185, tells of a young man named Herbert of Aurillac, who later became Pope Sylvester II. One day, this passionate young man met a girl named Meridiana who offered him sex, wealth, and power if he would only be faithful to her. The young man agreed, unaware that he had made a deal with a succubus. As a result, a new pontiff, Sylvester II, ascended to the papal throne, only to repent before his death of his cohabitation with the demon. The people of the Middle Ages lived in a wonderful world. Charming succubus lurked in the darkness, their wives wore belts of fidelity, and feudal lords enjoyed the right of lordship. But, as we see, all this exists only in the later legends of the Middle Ages.